this stimulus was integrated in our brain neurodynamics and make some senses of the, we have some kind of sense of perceptual experiences. But not all of this neural activity is related to our sensation of our perceptual experiences. So the question here is, can we quantify neural activity that is responsible for our perceptual experiences of the world? That's kind of a big question. And this talk is going to be a little bit different from what I usually do. I'm more statistical. I'm doing statistical analysis of neural spiking data. Today's talk is not more about like general big picture or like a manifest. So I hope that, I don't know how it works, but I hope it works. Let's see anyway. So I like to start from the very basic. I like to start from the very basic adaptive properties of the neural systems. That is gain modulation, and a little bit talk about information principle because it has to be related to information theory. And then I like to generalize this gain modulation to the Bayesian view of the brain, which is currently probably getting a standard view of the brain. And I like to talk about the recognition dynamics, how we perceive the world by real neural dynamics. And lastly, I like to talk about how to quantify the important part of the neural activity. First, the gain modulation. So it's a very, I like to start from very basic. So you know the neuron receives inputs and makes spikes. And when you code some outside world by neural systems, there are many different ways like you can code this by the timing of spikes, coordinated timing of spikes among neurons, and so on and so forth. But the most classical way to look at the coding by neurons is look at the firing rates. So you can think about the x-axis, the input strength. This is a summation of the synaptic inputs to these neurons, to this neuron. And y-axis is the firing rate of the neuron. And each neuron cannot fire indefinitely high firing rate. There is always, because of biophysical property like refractory period or sensitization to the stimulus, there is upper bound. It can be like 300, 400, but here it's written as 100 Hz. So because of this, if you write this so-called response, stimulus response curve or response curve, then it got to be nonlinear. And here's a typical nonlinear function of the neuron. And this nonlinear input-output relation is a hallmark of neural computation, right? So then for this system, if the stimuli falls on this area, then what happens is that neurons firing is always saturating near this maximum point. This is inefficient because you are using only a very small fraction of the dynamic range that the neuron can use. This also has a low sensitivity to the input stimuli. So you have to discriminate the large change in the input strengths by the small change in firing rate. So it's inefficient, not efficient. If you have a stimuli here, in the middle of this transition point, then the small input produces low firing rate, middle is middle, highest input causes high firing rate, and you can use the bandwidth of the output efficiently. It also has a high sensitivity to the small change in the input. So you can discriminate by using the large change in the firing rate, right? So what happens if you have saturating inputs? What the neural systems always does is this gain control or gain modulation. So they're going to change adaptively change this nonlinear function to that input. Okay. So just a moment. Okay, so this kind of system is seen in different areas. Of course, there's a light in retina, you see this gain modulation to the contrast luminance. And there is also a famous paper by Ozawa Izumi in Osaka University. He showed that Riemann also shows gain modulation. And of course, in our system, our eyes also has a pupil that changes its diameter, and also in the retina, there's a shift from rod and cones to adapt to the light intensity, so on and so forth. So there are a lot of multiple adaptive mechanisms so that we can gain the information reliably from the environment. And this type of gain modulation has what I showed is just moving this nonlinear function left and right, but there are many different ways to change these functions, and all are called gain modulation. And accordingly, there are many different types. Presumably, there are many different mechanisms underlying it. So the one is like changing the background liquid levels, channeling inhibition, synaptic depression, and so on and so forth. So, but anyway, what is important is that the gain modulation, the fundamental mechanism of the neurons, which does the integration of the information. So one is x-axis is one input source, and you have output, and how this another source of input changes this function. So it's integration of two or multiple input signals. And I just like to remind you that if we do this, describe this by math, what we always use is this logistic function. So this has a very nice property for binary neurons. So I just like to introduce this. So you have a nonlinear logistic function. And here you have a y is input data, and in my talk always y is data, and x is neural activity. And if you change y, you have a saturation, and y0 is bias. And by changing the bias, you can do gain modulation. But if you change some parameter beta here, which is similar to the inverse temperature in physics, you can also change the sensitivity to the input, right? So here is the interim summary. So the neural systems are equipped with multiple adaptation mechanisms. And this mechanism allows organisms to gain the information of the world maximally. I'm sorry, I think this this slide version didn't include the Infomax principle. But anyway, you can also show that this process, the output becomes evenly distributed, which means that the entropy of the output is maximized. And for the noiseless channel, this means that you maximizes mutual information between input and output. So this also sits in the so-called Infomax principle. Now, the gain modulation is a fundamental computation in the brain, which nonlinear integrates signals from multiple sources. And we can extend this to the Bayesian view of the brain. This view has been there since the 90s by Mumford, Kawato, but nowadays, I think, of course, from the effort of the Freestone, becoming more and more standard view. In this view, we see that brain has a generated process, generating model of the data that describes how the data is generated from causes and use it to estimate the causes from the data. So if you're not familiar with this, I'm going to explain very much briefly. So there is a physical world that produces this data. And to make it simple, we consider that there is some causes to produce this data. For example, for retina, you have a retina image. Image is pieces on your retina. And there should be some causes of light reflection. There is a physical system here. And maybe this cause is modulated by some context. Maybe on a sunny day or a cloudy day, the condition may change. Okay? And we are not, from our five senses, we are not able to access this information. So what we're going to do is that we have our approximate model of this process. And if you have this generated model, you can do the inference validation scheme. So this is a generated model of the world, and this describes how the cause generates the data, and we also need a prior for the causes, and this constrains the possible causes. And if you have this generated model again, you have this posterior density. Okay, but that's what I just said was it's just a Bayesian theory, Bayes theory, nothing to do with the Bayes brain. But Bayesian view of the brain says like how to implement this in a brain. And there are different types, different schools of views how to implement this in a brain. One is predictive coding, which I'm not gonna go into the details today. But another more straightforward way to see this is as follows. So very much simply, we consider that the cause is neural activity, and W is like a brain structure. What does this mean? So we try to represent the world data by the combination of the neural activity. Each neuron has some representation of the world, and the combination of this represent the world. And the neural activity has to be constrained in some way because of the biophysical properties of the neurons or some connections among the neurons. That should be written in the prior. Okay, without these mirrors, the neural activity is constrained following this prior. If you have this, then you can have this posterior. What is posterior? Posterior is the neural activity given the data, given the stimulus. So this is activation of the neural systems, the evoked response. So in a sense that you consider that this prior is a spontaneous activity of neurons, no stimuli applied, just spontaneous activity. And if you observe some data, this perturbs this spontaneous activity a little bit and produces the stimulus response, stimulus evoked activity. This is a one view, one way to see, to frame this Bayesian brain hypothesis. This is not just theoretical conventions, but this view has been developed over the last 30 years since the work by Arielis in Israel. What they found was like the prior spontaneous activity has a strong influence in activated stimulus response functions. Later, they found that they investigated the relationship between spontaneous activity and evoked activity. They found that they are very much close. And if theoretically you can show that these are close, if the average evoked activity of stimulus to many stimuli is close to spontaneous activity, we can show that the system has an optimal internal generated model. And this was confirmed by Philip in a period of work in science. So this work has been put forward by mainly by the Joseph Pizzos group in Brandeis University, and there are many papers by them. So if you're interested in it, I refer to these papers. I'm not going to go into the details of this behind experimental evidences for that, but these are very interesting topics. But now the most important classical generative model framework is also CIPA. So you can have a generated model of the image patches, natural scenes, and you can generate Guiwan-like neural receptive field. So if you're familiar, so this is called a linear model. So in this model, if you want to construct a generated model, you need to have observation and prior. What is observation? Observation, here we assume Gaussian distribution, and it's a way to construct images by the combination of the neural activity. Each neuron has some kind of representation of the world, which is called also basis functions. And if you combine these basis functions, you represent the image. That's a generated observation model. And here you add some Gaussian noise. It means that you assume some Gaussian observation. And then you have to constrain this neural activity itself, which is a prior. And here comes this sparse coding. So you assume that sparse and independent neural activity. And this, if you do that, and then if you do learning, then you get, as basis functions, you get this, the Gabor-like functions. So this is a very, very classical approaches to approaches of the generative model, although the original Rochassin field work doesn't write it in the innovation framework, but it's now the of course we are not doesn't have to be constrained with these linear observations, but you can think about non-linear observations that is more relevant for neural studies. So here, I'm sorry, the x can be taking either minus, negative, plus, positive, and positive some values. This is not like neural activity. But we can think about binary neurons. And in the case of the binary neurons, so the we can use this again this logistic function. So here you have input images, and you weight these images by phi here, which is a receptive field of neurons, and there is a bias term, and the response is non-linearly determined by this logistic function. And furthermore, you can consider the probabilistic output. So this is this logistic function is just from 0 and 1. So we can use this as a probability of having 1, and then probability of having 0 is 1 minus a. Right? And I can of course write this in a single term as a Bernoulli distribution. So if you have x is 1, you only have f here, and this part is 1. If you have 0, part is 1, and you obtain this 1 minus f. So okay, now this is a single neuron, but of course we can generalize this to multiple neurons. The simplest case is that you consider independent multiple neurons, then the probability of having a joint spiking of the n neurons is simply the product of this Bernoulli distribution. We can write this equation in an exponential family distribution, and which is in this form. And then if you put this logistic function here, then what you get is simply you take out of this one. So this is this is the joint simply Bernoulli distribution. But this is
you start from here. You start from posterior distribution.
No. What I like to do. Thank you very much. What I like to do is a connection between neural network activity and the generative model view. Here, what I do is neural network feed forward. Okay, given the data, what is the response, and you can write in this way, and it looks like posterior, right? And you can write here. Can write the same thing by using a generative model. Okay, so you can assume just like the previous also same field type model, you can assume Gaussian observation, but here x is binary. Okay, and for each binary neurons, we can put some kind of prior, but it's a Bernoulli prior, and if you compute the posterior, then what you get is basically very much the same equation as this, but the bias part comes from here. Bias part becomes like this. Bias part is basically related to the prior distribution. The prior density basically determines the firing rate of individual neurons. And beta here is a common parameter that changes the level of the firing rate for all the neurons. And you can see that by changing the prior parameters, the response function posterior moves by left and right. So by changing the prior means you do the gain modulation. Okay, and of course you don't have to think about the independent neurons, but you can also think about correlated neurons. And in this case, you have observation model like this, linear observations, and prior neural activity is, you can think about some correlated activities, and the standard way is to think about Ising model or Boltzmann machine. Okay, here, and I put some one single parameter that can change the precision of the observation, or beta that changes whole maybe fine grade of the neurons or correlations of neurons. And if you combine these, of course, you have a prior part and stimulus-related observation part. Okay. So that's the Bayesian view of the neural response functions, and you can do a simple simulation of the correlated neurons. For example, here you have a prior spontaneous activity, which is regulated by this parameter beta. And as a parameter, as a spontaneous activity, H0 is something related to all the neurons. I construct it in that way. And the stimulus X, this feature, comes from this observation model, stimulus-related activity. I picked up these 1, 2, 3 neurons. If you change this strength of X by changing alpha, basically you increase the activity of neuron 1 to 3. And this, the Ising model or this pattern probabilities produces patterns. But you can also marginalize each individual neural activity, and you can compute the fine grade. Okay. And if you look at neuron 4, 5, and here is the activity rate of individual neurons when you change the stimulus strength by changing alpha. So neuron 4, 5 are not related to stimulus-related activity. So by changing alpha, there's no change. And but if you look at neuron 1 to 3, then by increasing alpha, you have an increase of fine grade. And this pretty much look like a sigmoidal function because, sorry, logistic function because it's kind of generalization of logistic functions. So so you have this saturation at 1, and then you can change the level of the all background or spontaneous activity by changing beta. So here the dotted line was beta equal to 1, but you can change this parameter. And by convention, by making it smaller, 0.8 means that we increase the fire rate. And so please remember that smaller beta means higher fire rate for all the neurons. And if you do so, the neuron 4, 5, of course, increases fine rate. And so does the neuron 1 to 3, but because it saturates, we have a shift. So by changing the parameters that comes from the prior, you can do the gain modulation, even for correlated neural systems. Okay, so that's the interim summary. So the stochastic outputs of a neural network are regarded as samples from posterior constructed from a generating model. I think more deeper view will be given by the Akuya in the next talk. And the gain modulation is realized by changing the parameters of the generating model. And the evoked activity of neurons and this gain modulation can be modeled by the Ising model. Now, here I provide a view to look at the stimulus evoked activity as a posterior, and I constructed a model. But this model, this view is kind of very much static. It's like if you give some generating model, you calculate the posterior, you get the posterior instantaneously. But you can do this if you are doing machine learning. You just can do some Laplace approximation of the posterior or something like that. can instantly obtain posterior. But you want to construct this posterior activity by neurodynamics, then there is, of course, this dynamics. So let's look at really what happens in the neural systems, how to, when they construct this posterior activity, the inference activity or recognition dynamics. And here's the view of here's the famous review paper by Victor Lame's group. This is the initial onset of the visual stimulus response in the entire brain areas of monkey. And this initial onset, initial spikes, so to say, represents the feed-forward sweep of the visual inputs. There's no feedback connections coming for this initial activity. And this initial activity can appear less than 40 milliseconds in the V1 area, and up to the temporal cortex, you can reach, so the activity reaches within about 100 milliseconds. Okay? After that, 100 milliseconds later, the temporal cortex is activated, and then they may have feedback to V1 neurons or earlier sensory areas. Okay? But this initial sweep are not related to feedback. Okay? And what Professor Rame's group has been working on this very, very interesting experiments for a long time. This is called the figure ground separation. So when you show for example, so let's look at the bottom part. You see some lines, oriented lines, and you record from the V1 neurons. Sorry, I think it was V1. Yes, sorry, V1 neurons, and as we saw in the model, the V1 neurons responded to orientations, and classical theory, V1 neurons look at on the very tiny fraction of the visual field, and if they show this image, this neuron that has a receptive field in the center, they respond within 30 milliseconds. There's initial sweep of response, and it goes down. And for the case of this bottom panel, the activity rate goes down. Bottom side, okay, bottom line. However, if there is a figure ground, so this picture is called the figure ground separation. There's a figure here on top of the background. It's just that the background part was 90-degree oriented to the right, and this part is identical to this field. So according to the classical receptive field, the neuron's response should not change. However, there is a difference appears after 100 milliseconds later. So this is a response for figure ground separated input, and there is a sustained firing rate. And this happens 100 milliseconds later. And Victor's group, there was a lot of discussion, but Victor's group claims that this is due to the feedback modulation. This global context comes from the higher visual areas. And they found that for example, did some lesion studies of the extrastriatal cortex and showed that this modulation couldn't happen, and so on and so forth. But there's still a debate, of course. But what they found is interesting. What is most interesting is is as follows. This late gain modulation is related to your perceptual, the monkey's perceptual experience. So if you show this figure ground image when the receptive field on neurons is here, you always show this figure ground separation, figure ground image, but sometimes the monkey misses to find this figure, okay? Although the stimulus has this figure ground, okay? In this case, when monkey can report the presence of the figure ground, then you see the modulation after 100 milliseconds later. But the monkey, if monkey fails to report, then there is no this late modulation. Okay, so somehow this 100 milliseconds later, maybe the V1 and receives the feedback modulation from higher areas, and this whole entire temporal cortex are working as a recognition system of this system. And if there is no feedback input, then we may not have the monkey may not have this perceptual experiences. More classical study is about the late game modulation is the spatial attention studies. This is certainly a feedback modulation. This is the V4 neurons activity by the Reynolds and Dejerons. And here you show some, again, the grading stimulus and the receptive feedback of, in this case, V4 is here. And you show, and the monkey can attend to this left side or right-hand side. You can train the monkey in that way, and you can record the activity when the monkey is attended to the stimulus or attended away from the stimulus. And if you look at the response of these neurons, then the initial activity goes up, and if it's attended away, it attenuates quickly. But if it's attended, presumably by feedback, top-down feedback, you have a sustained activity. And what is more important about this experiments is that they found this is gain modulation. So they changed the contrast of the stimulus. So here, left-hand column is a low contrast, and the right-hand side is high contrast. Of course, if you increase the contrast, fine rate increases. And if you can write this as again, this stimulus response function as a function of the contrast, and you have these nonlinear functions, and whether this attention modulates this response function in a gain modulation manner or not. And what they found was, yes, this is the input gain modulation. Okay. This is their result. So as I talked about, the gain modulation is one very basic principle in your system to adapt to the environment. But here, this kind of the very high cognitive task is also explained by the basic mechanism of the gain modulation, which adapts to, in this case, the context of the task. Okay. And oops. I don't know, maybe I made a Mac, PowerPoint by Mac. It's in Windows. So, okay, it's corrupted. But maybe this is also related to consciousness. And the first person who reported this, of course, the Benjamin Libet, and he showed that the component of the human tactile, human somatosensory cortex to the tactile stimuli, their first initial response is the same for subconscious stimuli or conscious stimuli. But if you look at the second component, there's a big difference. Okay, and of course, for consciousness studies, we need the humans, and related to this, for example, visual masking, especially the common onset masking paradigm, reveals that there is a feedback. If you disrupt the feedback that happens later, you will lose the conscious experience of the stimuli or TMS, like 100 milliseconds later, after the stimulus presentation. You can disrupt the conscious experiences of that. And also in EEG, you see a later components. Many papers report that the later components like P1, N1, and 2 are much more related to cognitive perspective of the brain activity. So there are maybe this is also related to consciousness. So now what we would like to do is that now that we know the dynamics of the neural systems, dynamics of the recognition in real system, I'd like to model this. The modeling, so basically I like to model this attentional gain modulation. This is the delayed gain modulation, which I like to model by the same Ising model. So here, we already saw that the neural response can be modulated by changing the prior. And sorry. Okay. And here a little bit math. Before that, so we have these two components for the posterior. One is the spontaneous activity or prior, and the other is a stimulus-related activity. And we write this as a feature, summarized as H0, while stimulus-related part is X. Okay, and if you think about this, the beta is a natural parameter with exponential family distribution, and this feature part, if you take an expectation of the features, this H0 by X by this distribution itself, this constitutes expectation parameter. These are two dual coordinates, of course. This is information geometry, and I call this the first part the average expectation of the spontaneous features, internal activities, and the stimulus-related activity is expectation of the observation part is a stimulus-related activity. And if you can weight these two different features, and if you, for example, if you put 0 here, alpha is 0 and beta 1, then you can produce spontaneous activity. But from there, if you change alpha, and if it goes up to 1, then this you can construct this exact posterior or evoked activity. Okay? By changing this alpha, you can change the stimulus component. And if you compute the entropy of this neural population, and if you think about this change of the entropy, of course we have this the concentration of entropy, and this tells you that the how much entropy of the entropy change of the neural populations, how much is explained by change of the internal activity, how much is explained by change of the stimulus-related activity. And of course, this is very analogous to the thermodynamic first law of thermodynamics, and especially this part is like a force applied to a gas. So you apply the stimulus and it changes the entropy. Okay. So the now taking this into account, we can think about the gain modulation, delayed gain modulation of the neural evoked activity. And for that, first I can change as a stimulus response, I can change alpha so that it responds and it goes on. This is a change of alpha from 0 to 1. It increases and it goes on. I just made this alpha dynamics so that it looks like stimulus response. And then beta change appears later with slower time constant. So once alpha is activated, later you have gain modulation. Okay? So here's a response of the neural activity rate of individual neuron 1 to 3, stimulus-related neurons, and it increases. So for dashed line, is the case when there is no gain modulation, no delayed gain modulation. So you have, by increasing alpha, you have also buying rate of neuron 1 to 3 increases and decreases. And if you have delayed gain modulation, this means that initially there is no gain modulation, but later you have a stronger gain modulation. Okay. This allows us to sustain the stimulus-related activity without excessively increasing the initial response. Okay, and if you write this in a phase diagram, so as you can see, this model is simply the parameter of this dimension is just 2. So you have beta and alpha. And you can also describe this system by expectation parameter, which is also 2 dimension. And so you can also pick up the natural parameter and expectation parameter. And you can also, this also specify the system. And if you write in this way, the when there is no gain modulation, beta is fixed, and the internal activity contains all 5 neurons. And when the stimulus is on and alpha changes, neuron 1 to 3 increases firing rate, which is contained in this U. So U also changes. So U increases and decreases. But because beta is fixed, this is written as a line. But if there is a gain modulation, then you have initially, when your activity goes down, you have a strong modulation, and you have a cycle. And if you write this in similarly, you can write this alpha V diagram. It's the same. You have a line for no gain modulation, but there is a cycle if you have delayed gain modulation. And if you think you apply this the entropy preservation equation, the first law, then for cycle, you found that, of course, this 0 equal to this area. This means that area in this diagram, the areas of these 2 diagrams are the same, equal. And if you have this cycle, then immediately this is you can show that this is equivalent to almost analogous to having similarly to heat engine. Here we call the information-theoretic engine. Okay, so this is basically by using the gain modulation, delayed gain modulation. We have an excess increase of entropy. This part is used to stimulus-related entropy changes. Okay, that's a view of the delayed gain modulation as an engine. And you can quantify the efficiency of this engine just like the thermodynamic engine, thermal engines, heat engines. And here is the different cycles with different time constant of the beta, while the maximum gain modulation is fixed. Maximum is 0.9. Remember that smaller means higher gain modulation in this case. We fix this, but if we change the time constant of this gain modulation, then if you have a strong, longer time constant, then but without changing so much the initial rise, you can keep the stimulus-related activity for a long time. By using this feedback gain modulation, you keep the stimulus activity for a long time. Okay? And you can quantify the entropic efficiency. And as we increase the time constant, it reaches certain value, 0.1, which is achieved by the cycle, which is very similar to the Carnot cycle in thermodynamics. So here the Interim Summary is that experimental evidences suggest that the modulation of the rate component is related to awareness, attention, and maybe conscious experiences. And the delayed modulation is modeled as a process, the dynamic Bayesian inference, and this process is analogous to works as an information-theoretic engine. And this view allows us to quantify the amount of efficiency of the amount and also the efficiency of the delayed gain modulation in terms of entropy changes. So far is the just the toy model example, but how can we actually quantify the internal gain modulation following this framework. So it's not the only, for this purpose, maybe not for this purpose, but we have been developing so-called state-space Ising model for the last 10 years, which allows us to do so. So this is kind of my main work, that is analysis of real neural spiking data by using the Ising model as a population activity. And however, we're going to fit to the spiking data this Ising model and estimate those parameters. But if you apply the stationary model, this means that you assume the rate of the neurons doesn't change, stationary population doesn't change. But if you want to analyze the evoked stimulus, evoked activity, just like we discussed, we need more dynamic inference scheme. So this state space method allows us to dynamically trace those parameters by sequential-based estimation. So here, every time step, we consider the certain parameters for Ising model. From this, we think that data coming from this graphs. Okay? And this graph changes over the time. And this is a scheme of the model. And from the data on this binary patterns only, we can infer the underlying dynamics. There is the example application to the V4 data. So the V4 neurons only they show some, again, the grating stimulus. And here is a population response. The multiple neurons simultaneous recordings and multiple trials. And here is the population firing rate. And because of this grating stimulus, the population activity oscillates. Okay? And if you ignore this massive firing rate oscillations and do a static, apply static Ising model and static correlation analysis, you get the wrong, strong pairwise correlations. But you have to remove this firing rate dynamics. And if you do so, the result is opposite. So this is the graph, Ising graph, before the stimulus, during the stimulus, and after the stimulus. And you see that during the stimulus presentation, which is shown in the gray area, there is a decorrelation. Okay. And again, I think this version somehow doesn't have a movie. So you can also see that dynamically this change and the graph changes when you have a stimulus onset. And what is important is that when we make this model, we try to apply a lot of approximation methods to make it possible to analyze a large number of neurons. Currently, large means, I think, in this case, like 40 or 50 neurons, which is not large enough in the standard of current recording technology, so we have to catch up. But by doing so, by fitting this Ising model to large-scale neurons, what we can do is we can infer the network property of neurons. So again, this is a model of physics, statistical physics. So once we fit, we can compute the macroscopic properties such as the free energy of the system, entropy of the system, and using entropy or Kyoto divergence, projecting this Ising model to the independent model, we can quantify how much correlations are present in the system by a single measure, or fluctuation of the system known as heat capacity, all in a time-resolved manner. And you can see that, for example, the correlations are high before the stimulus onset, and there's a decorrelation here, and higher later, and so on and so forth. So what we like to do is from fitting microscopically, want to infer the large microscopic scale, and eventually try to understand the recognition dynamics. So we have a scheme to infer the dynamic neural responses. So I think it's feasible to think about this delayed gain modulation or generative model scheme. It's feasible to apply generative model scheme in the real neuron spiking data analysis. So the summary here, I repeat again. So the gain modulation is ubiquitously observed in nervous systems as a mechanism to adapt neurons' nonlinear response functions to stimulus distributions. The Bayesian brain provides a statistical paradigm for the gain modulation that integrates observed stimulus and prior knowledge. And the delayed gain modulation of the stimulus response via recurrent feedback connection is modeled as a dynamic process of the Bayesian inference that integrates observation prior with time delay. And if you have this time delay, this process forms an information-theoretic engine, okay? A mathematical analog of a heat engine in thermodynamics. And this view allows us to quantify the efficiency of retaining stimulus information by the gain modulation in terms of entropy change. Now, this quantity is expected to correlate with the perceptual capacity of the animal, according to many previous studies. And I think the state space analytic model, one promising method to reveal this dynamics. Okay, so thank you very much. I take a question.
Could you show me the slide page of delayed dynamics of alpha and beta? This dynamics representing what maximization of likelihood was. What's the meaning of this dynamics?
This is simply find, for example, bottom is a firing rate of neuron 1 to 3. That's all, sorry. Maybe I was not clear enough. The neuron 1 to 3 are changed by changing alpha. So this X has this X actually contains only X1, X2, and X3. And if you increase alpha, you basically increase firing rate of these neurons. Okay. So that's what I do here. I change alpha from 0 to alpha. Accordingly, firing rate of a neuron 1 to 3 increases. Okay.
What do you mean by this dynamics of alpha and beta? So it's not learning or inference.
It's the recognition dynamics, and I'm not talking about any learning here. The learning is related to learning the parameters in the prior observation model. This currently this is fixed, and what I'm considering here is the dynamics that constructs the exact posterior, exact inference. Towards the exact inference. So if you have 1 and 1, you beta equal 1, alpha equal 1, you get exact inference, exact posterior. So initially you have a exact inference. Then you have a decline of activity, and after that you have some modulation to this inference.
I will ask later.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for the talk. So what is your opinion, especially because I think you're giving a very good perspective on neuronal dynamics and then how to extrapolate macroscopic properties. So what do you think, where do you think the Bayesian brain ideas should be looked at what level? Microscopic, mesoscopic, macroscopic? Where do you think is the best?
There are many different perspectives. So this view is quite macroscopic view. So what I'm trying to do is quite opposite to the history of the thermodynamics. So thermodynamics was built to understand engine, and the statistical physics was built to understand thermodynamics. And statistical physics, the branch is like the Ising model of material sciences, and this is turned out to be the memory of the brain by Hopfield and Amari Sensei as well. And but now we have this inverse Ising problem. So by fitting this, we are going to backward, and up to literally to the end. And that's a very, very big, grand view, so to say. But the microscopic level, we want to realize this Bayesian brain by spiking neurons. How is learning? I didn't talk about learning here, but how learning can be implemented by this scheme, free energy principle, and also inference as well. So there is still a difficulty in learning, and under only certain constraints of the network type, we can realize this, like tree-type structures. This I'm working with a student in India. So there are different levels to approach this.
Right, thank you very much for the talk. This is my first introduction into this definition of the Bayesian brain, where I've been conditioned towards more of the predictive coding model.
I see.
So I was wondering whether in this model there's any sort of learning, because I could not understand the prior, how you describe it as like a spontaneous firing. Because to me, the prior should have like some sort of an internal representation of maybe the world or whatever you're talking about, depending on the context. But in your model, I don't see like there's some sort of learning, because if you're saying that the prior is a spontaneous firing, then if you like put a stimuli and this is modulated, but this is transient. This is unlike the prior that builds some kind of a model, or there's a learning process happening. So I just want to clear.
Yeah, exactly. So today's talk is only about the recognition dynamics, and I didn't talk about the learning process. And if you think about the learning means that in this framework, for example, you can generalize the Bayesian posterior by putting beta and alpha in front of the observation and prior. And this is generalized Bayesian view that the parameters of the model is fixed, and I can only consider how to generate the exact posterior as a dynamics. But when you think about the learning of these parameters in generate the model, this is a usual scheme of the machine learning. You do this by maximizing the marginal likelihood. And it turns out that this process can be written as a second law of thermodynamics in a formal manner. And so learning can be done very much similarly to the machine learning scheme. And talking about the true real neural activities, spontaneous activity and evoked activity are becoming similar over the learning in real animals, which implies that you have optimal inference and also optimal marginal likelihood, maximizing marginal likelihood. And this is confirmed in real ferret experiments. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but we can talk.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. And I want to ask a question about attention. So it seems that this mechanism you mentioned is very like bottom-up attention. So
the bottom and top down attention.
You think it's top down, but it's conditional on your external sensory input, right?
Yes.
And then the modulation comes out.
Yes.
So to me, it's more like bottom-up attention.
Basically, many of the top-down attentions are
Yes.
stimulus-driven, and of course, if you show some the cues, the initial cues that when task starts,
Yeah.
maybe even before the stimulus onset, there may be effect of attention. There's a debate if there is effect of attention before the stimulus, after the stimulus, but some shows before, some shows after. And after doesn't really necessarily mean if it appears later, then it's kind of top down.
Okay, so I think I have two questions about this. One is, so do you think this attention is just the of some information or optimization process?
Yeah, I think so. So as I said, the attention, the Reynolds study showed that attention is also gain modulation,
Yes.
which can be interpreted as maximization of information.
Okay. And yeah, related to what you say, the second question is, so in your framework, how do you combine bottom up and bottom up, top down and bottom up attention together? Is it possible?
This I don't know. I'm not truly expert on the attentional studies, and there are many experts on doing this in machine learning and the real neuroscience. So I cannot answer that question. So
No problem.
I come from the lab in attentional studies.
Okay, thanks.
I found very interesting the decorrelation of the neurons during the stimuli.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate a bit more, like what is the biological implication?
Okay, so the biological implications maybe while the stimulus is first is mechanism, and some people say, like for example, Tan's paper, Nature paper said like they balance the neural systems are balanced in stimulation inhibition, and if it's near the balance is near the threshold, the neurons are synchronously fires and they correlate. And while the stimulation is on, this balance is upstate, and if stimulus is off, then this is more down. And so there is such studies that this more asynchronous activity appears during stimulus presentation, which may be related to this, but I think that's what's given data, and that's the mechanism part. And the second part is the information. Theoretically, actually, we don't know if the correlation is good for coding the orientation of the stimulus or not. This is because when you think about the information coding about the stimulus, you not only need to know the firing rate and correlation of neurons, but you also need to know the tuning functions to compute the Fisher information of the stimulus. Just Dosan talked about if you have a multiple stimuli, in his case it's just one dimension, but if you have multiple cases, you have a slope of the tuning functions and correlation variance matrix. And in general, if you have the neurons which has similar tuning functions, the correlation is good. But if you have heterogeneous tuning functions, not necessarily. Positive correlation can be good. And there's a long history about information coding theory that what kind of correlation makes better when this tuning function is, and so on and so forth. And I am working on this as well. Interesting to discuss this.
Okay. If there are no more questions, then let's thank Hideaki.